On a sunlit morning in early August, Margaret and John Wilson arrived at a secluded resort, tucked away amidst the lush greenery of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The trip had been John's suggestion. A chance to reconnect after their busy lives in the city had created a distance between them. Margaret, 42, had welcomed the idea, hoping it might rekindle the spark in their marriage of 15 years. John, always the calm and composed partner, appeared particularly eager, though his attentiveness seemed tinged with a strange, almost anxious energy. Their first day at the resort was filled with the usual activities: hikes through dense trails, a dip in the lake, and an intimate dinner on the balcony of their room, overlooking a sunset that painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Yet, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that John's mind was elsewhere. His smiles were just a little too quick, his laughter a touch too strained. She put it down to work stress and decided to let it slide, hoping that time together would bring him back to her fully. On their second day, as they strolled through a quaint town nearby, Margaret decided to visit a local market, while John mentioned he'd head to a nearby cafe to catch up on some reading. They parted with a quick kiss, and Margaret meandered through the stalls, enjoying the laid-back atmosphere. It was by chance that she stumbled across a small bookstore with a window displaying a row of family photos, a quaint collection that captured vacations, local festivals, and smiling faces of families enjoying the town's charm. Her eye caught on a photo in the corner. John, with a woman and 2 children, children she did not recognize. They were posed in front of a merry-go-round, John's arm casually wrapped around the woman's waist. Her heart froze. At first, Margaret tried to convince herself it was a look-alike, but the more she stared, the more undeniable it became. It was her husband, smiling with a warmth she hadn't seen in years. Her mind raced, trying to process what this meant. Without thinking, she bought the photo from the shopkeeper, slipping it into her bag as she fought to maintain her composure. She returned to the cafe, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag tightly, her heart thudding against her ribs. There he was, sitting at a table, reading as if everything was perfectly normal. Margaret slid into the chair across from him, placing the photo face down on the table. John glanced up, surprised by the abruptness in her movements. She pushed the photo towards him without a word, her expression betraying the turmoil beneath the surface. He hesitated before flipping it over. The moment he saw the picture, the blood drained from his face, and the mask he'd worn so expertly for years slipped. Margaret watched him, her anger simmering just beneath her shock. "Who are they, John?" she demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper, but heavy with accusation. "Who is she?" John's eyes darted around the cafe, checking if anyone was watching. Then, seeing no escape, he leaned in closer, his voice barely steady. "Margaret, I can explain. It's not what you think, not what I think," she interrupted, her voice rising despite her attempt to keep it down. "You have a whole other family, don't you? While I've been here hoping, waiting for you to come back to me, you've been playing happy father somewhere else." He flinched at her words, knowing there was no way out of this corner. The secret he'd buried so deeply had finally surfaced, and he could see the hurt in Margaret's eyes. "Yes," he admitted, the word escaping him like a sigh, the weight of years collapsing onto the cafe table between them. "I met Emily a few years ago. I thought I could keep everything separate, that you'd never find out." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, the betrayal cutting deeper than she'd imagined possible. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely steady. 3 years, he confessed, unable to meet her gaze. I thought I could be there for both of you, but it got complicated." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that her life with John, the life she had thought was real, was built on lies. She rose abruptly from the table, turning away from him, her mind already racing towards what she needed to do next. Without a backward glance, she walked out of the cafe, leaving John behind, clutching the photograph of his fractured double life. As Margaret drove back to the resort alone, she knew there was no turning back. The vacation that was meant to heal had torn their life open, exposing a truth she never imagined she'd have to face. And as she stared at the winding road ahead, she realized that the path to finding herself again would be as twisted and uncertain as the mountain roads she now traveled. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated the winding roads back to the resort. Her mind was a chaotic storm of emotions: betrayal, anger, grief. She wanted to scream, to cry, to rage against the years that had been stolen from her. But all she could do was drive, the tires of the rental car crunching over gravel as she neared the isolated cabin where they were staying. When she arrived, the resort felt strangely quiet, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Margaret made her way into the cabin, slamming the door behind her, the sound echoing through the empty space. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the framed photos from their past vacations, their smiles in Paris, their anniversary in Hawaii, all now tainted by the knowledge that somewhere he had been creating new memories with another woman and their children. She grabbed one of the frames, hurling it against the wall where it shattered into pieces, the glass splintering across the hardwood floor. The release felt good, but fleeting, leaving her with a deeper ache. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, her mind struggling to comprehend how she had missed the signs, how easily she had been fooled. The door creaked open behind her. She didn't turn, but she knew it was John. She could feel his presence, the weight of his guilt filling the room. He closed the door softly, as if trying not to shatter the fragile space between them even further. "Margaret, he started, but she cut him off, her voice raw. "Save it, John. There's nothing you can say that will make this right." He took a step closer, his voice filled with desperation. "I know I hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I never wanted to lose you. I thought I could balance it all, that I could be the husband you deserved and still be there for them." She laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar. "Balance. That's what you call lying to me for 3 years, having children with another woman while you shared a bed with me? You've been living a lie, John, and you made me a part of it without my knowledge. You've ruined everything." He flinched, but instead of arguing, he sank into the armchair across from her, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I did, and I don't even know where to begin to make it right." Margaret stared at him, her anger giving way to a cold, clear resolve. She realized that there was no apology he could give that would mend the rift he had torn through their lives. Her future, the one she had imagined with him, had evaporated in the moment she saw that photograph. "You can't make it right, John," she said, her voice firm. "And I don't think you ever even tried. You were selfish, thinking you could have everything without losing anything. But you've lost me, John. I don't care what you do with them, or how you want to salvage your other life. I'm done being part of this lie." John's shoulders sagged, the full weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed he could control the narrative, that he could manage his double life like another investment. But now, facing Margaret's resolute anger, he realized just how wrong he had been. She stood up, grabbing her suitcase from the closet and tossing her clothes into it haphazardly. He rose too, crossing the room towards her, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder, but she pulled away sharply. "Don't," she warned, her voice low and dangerous. "Just don't. I'm leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." For a moment, he just stood there, a broken man, watching the life he had known unravel in front of him. He wanted to beg her to stay, to promise he would make things right, but he knew deep down that any promises he made now would be empty, like the ones he'd made to himself every time he visited his other family. She zipped up her suitcase and brushed past him, her footsteps firm as she headed for the door. But just as she reached for the handle, she paused, turning back to face him one last time. Her eyes, once filled with warmth for him, were now icy with determination. "When I get back to the city, I'm calling a lawyer. I'm going to expose everything, John. You'll have to choose which life you want, but you won't have both." With that, she swung the door open, the cool mountain air rushing in to meet her. She walked out, leaving John behind in the cabin, surrounded by the echoes of their shattered life. As she climbed into the car and drove away, the weight that had been crushing her began to lift, replaced by a new sense of freedom. It would be a long road ahead, filled with uncertainty and pain, but it would be her road, one where she was no longer a victim of his deceit. Back in the cabin, John sat down heavily on the bed, staring at the shards of broken glass on the floor. He had gambled with his life, with Margaret's trust, and now he was alone, the cost of his secrets laid bare. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves as storm clouds gathered in the distance, mirroring the turmoil that awaited them both. Margaret drove through the winding roads, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting shadows through the dense canopy of trees. Her grip on the steering wheel was steady now, her tears drying on her cheeks. She had made her decision, and the clarity that came with it felt like a breath of fresh air, even amidst the hurt. She had left behind the cabin, the years of deception, and the man she had once thought she knew. She felt a determination rise within her, a promise that she would take back control of her life, no matter how painful the process might be. As the sun set behind the mountains, she reached the edge of the small town, pulling into a gas station to collect her thoughts. She knew she needed to call someone, her sister maybe, or her best friend back home. She needed to start the process of unraveling the life she had built with John, step by step. But as she reached for her phone, she paused, staring out across the highway. It struck her that she was truly on her own, and for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't scare her. It felt like a challenge. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, John sat alone in the fading light, his mind replaying the last few hours over and over. He tried to focus, to make sense of the mess he had made, but all he could see was Margaret's face as she pushed the photograph toward him, the pain in her eyes as she realized the depth of his betrayal. He could hear the echoes of her words, each one a reminder of how completely he had lost control of his life. He picked up his phone, his hand shaking slightly. He had messages from Emily. She was expecting him back in a few days. She had no idea what had just happened, no inkling that his carefully maintained balance between his two lives had collapsed in a matter of minutes. He dialed her number, but then stopped, staring at the screen. What would he even say? That his wife had found out? That their lives were about to be blown apart? That everything he had built was falling to pieces? Instead, he turned off the phone, tossing it onto the bed. He couldn't face her. He couldn't face anyone. The quiet of the cabin pressed in on him, suffocating in its stillness. For the first time in years, he found himself truly alone. No distractions, no lies, no layers of deception to hide behind. He walked to the balcony, staring out at the distant lights of the town below. He thought about Margaret's last words, the promise that she would expose everything. He imagined the life he had built, with Emily falling apart just like his marriage with Margaret had. He saw his career crumbling under the weight of scandal, the life he had curated slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, John felt a wave of fear wash over him. Fear not just of what he would lose, but of what kind of man he had become. He had convinced himself that he could have everything, that he could love two women in his own way, that he could be a father to children he had hidden from his first wife. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he saw the emptiness beneath it all. Margaret, on the other hand, felt that emptiness began to fill with something new. As she continued her drive back toward the city, she made a call to a lawyer, setting in motion the steps she needed to break free of her marriage legally. Each call was like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming her sense of self. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that she'd have to face the questions, the gossip, the pain of starting over. But she also knew that she had a chance to rebuild a life that was truly her own, without the shadow of John's secrets hanging over her. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of difficult conversations and paperwork. John tried to reach out a few times, sending emails and leaving voicemails where he apologized, pleaded, and sometimes tried to justify his actions. But Margaret never replied. Each message only strengthened her resolve to close that chapter of her life. She changed the locks on their home, packed up his things, and sent them to an address she barely glanced at: Emily's address. For John, the fallout was swift and brutal. Emily, blindsided by the news of Margaret's discovery, ended their relationship as soon as she learned of his lies. She took the children and left town, cutting all ties with him. His firm, hearing of the scandal, quietly pushed him into early retirement, the whispers of his double life tainting his reputation beyond repair. He found himself alone in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of town, struggling to come to terms with how thoroughly he had unraveled his own life. Margaret, however, began to rediscover herself, piece by piece. She moved into a small, sunny apartment downtown, filled it with the things she loved, and began teaching yoga classes again, finding solace in the routines that had once brought her peace. She reached out to old friends, reconnected with her sister, and allowed herself to grieve for the life she had lost, but also to dream about the life that could come next. One evening, as autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, she found herself walking along the river that wound through the city. She paused on a bridge looking out at the water and felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She thought of John, wondered where he was, how he was coping with the wreckage of his own making, but she felt no desire to reach out, no longing to return to what once was. In that moment, Margaret understood that while her marriage had ended in betrayal and pain, it had also set her free. Free from the lies, free from the weight of a love that had become hollow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she took a deep breath and let the cool air fill her lungs, feeling the last remnants of her old life slip away with the current below. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to begin again.